My daughter called me from the hospital at 6:47 in the morning, and the first thing I heard wasn't her voice. It was silence. That half-second of silence before she spoke told me everything I needed to know about how bad it was. Dad. Her voice cracked on that one word. It's Mom. She had a fall. My wife, Norma, had been getting up early her whole life. 51 years of marriage, and she still made coffee before sunrise, still fed the birds off the back deck before most people in our neighborhood had opened their eyes. That morning she'd slipped on the deck steps. The frost had come early this year in Asheville, North Carolina, and nobody had expected it. I don't remember driving to Mission Hospital. I just remember being there. I remember the fluorescent lights in the hallway and the smell of floor cleaner and the way my hands wouldn't stop shaking, even after the nurse told me Norma was stable. Hip fracture, they said. She'd need surgery. She'd need to stay for several days, maybe longer. She was 68 years old and strong as anyone I knew, but she was lying in that bed with her eyes closed and tubes in her arm, and she looked smaller than I'd ever seen her. I'm Clifton Marsh. I spent 31 years working as a claims adjuster for a regional insurance firm in Buncombe County. Not glamorous work, but honest. I know how to read people. I know when something doesn't add up. I thought that skill would protect me from most things in this world. I was wrong about that. Our son-in-law, Kyle, drove my daughter over to the hospital within the hour. Melody was our youngest. 38 years old, sharp and quick, worked as an accountant at a local firm. She'd been married to Kyle for 9 years. Kyle was in commercial real estate, drove a newer Silverado, always had something to say at family dinners, always had an angle. I'd never said that out loud. You don't say things like that about your daughter's husband. You smile and pass the rolls. He shook my hand in the hallway outside Norma's room. Firm grip, concerned expression. Terrible news, Clifton. Just terrible. Let us know anything you need. I thanked him. That's what you do. The room had 2 beds separated by a curtain. The woman on the other side of that curtain, I didn't see her at first. I could hear her breathing, slow and even. She was asleep when I arrived. A nurse told me later her name was Agatha Ruiz. 73 years old, she'd been brought in 2 nights before with complications from a minor procedure. No visitors. I noticed that. You notice things like that in a hospital. You notice who gets flowers and who doesn't. For the first 2 days, I barely slept. I sat in the chair beside Norma's bed and dozed off in 20-minute stretches and woke up every time a nurse came in. On the second evening, Agatha's side of the curtain had been quiet all day, and I figured she was sleeping again. But around 9 o'clock, I heard her shift in her bed and make a small sound, and then her voice came through the curtain. Is there someone there? I got up, pushed the curtain aside carefully. She was lying on her back, white-haired and slight, her eyes open and looking at the ceiling. I introduced myself, told her my wife was on the other side. She turned her head and looked at me. Sharp eyes, dark brown, older than the rest of her. I told her I'd gotten coffee from the machine down the hall if she wanted some. She said she'd take it black. We talked for maybe 20 minutes that first night. She asked about Norma, asked how long we'd been married, asked what I'd done for work. She listened the way people don't really listen anymore. Like she was keeping track of every word. When I mentioned Melody and Kyle had been by earlier, something changed in her face. Just for a second. Like a door closing quietly. I noticed that too. I asked if she had family nearby. She said she had a son in Charlotte. Then she was quiet for a while. Then she said, he doesn't come. I didn't push. That felt like something she'd said before, to other people in other rooms. On the 3rd morning, I brought her a proper coffee from the Starbucks 2 blocks over, and one of those blueberry muffins she could actually eat. She sat up when I came in and looked more rested. We talked longer that time. She asked about Kyle again. Not directly. She asked what he did, how long Melody had been with him, whether he was close with Norma and me. I told her what I thought was the truth. He's part of the family. We make it work. Agatha set her coffee down and looked at me carefully. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. I said, all right. When your son-in-law is around, how do you feel? I laughed a little. That was an odd question. I told her I felt fine. She waited. I don't know, I said after a moment, a little like I'm being managed, maybe. Like he's always deciding what the conversation is going to be about before it starts. She nodded slowly. Do you know what your finances look like right now? Not 6 months ago. Right now. I told her yes, of course. I'd handled our finances for decades. She said, when did you last check your retirement accounts yourself? Not through a summary someone handed you. You, logging in, looking at the numbers. I opened my mouth, closed it. The truth was, Kyle had helped me set up a new online portal about 8 months earlier. Said the old platform was clunky. Said he'd streamline things, make it easier to see everything in one place. I'd watched him do it. He'd been patient and helpful. I'd logged in a few times since, seen the balances, assumed everything was fine. Agatha Ruiz watched me do the math in my head. I had a son-in-law too, she said. He was attentive. He was helpful. He came every Sunday and fixed things around the house and told my son not to worry, that he had everything under control. She paused. By the time I understood what that meant, he'd moved $140,000 out of my accounts into ones I'd never seen. She looked at the window. My son didn't know, or he didn't want to know. It comes out the same in the end. I didn't sleep that night. I told myself Agatha was a stranger. I told myself her situation wasn't mine. Kyle had his own career, his own income. He didn't need our money. We weren't wealthy people, just careful ones. A paid-off house on the west side of Asheville, some retirement savings, the modest life of two people who'd worked hard and spent carefully. But I lay in that chair beside Norma's bed, and I thought about the portal Kyle had set up. I thought about how I'd handed him my laptop without a second thought. I thought about the way he'd said, "Don't worry about the old interface, Clifton. I'll handle it." Norma had her surgery on the 4th day. It went well. Dr. Kessler came out and told me she'd done great, said she'd be in recovery for a few hours and I should go get some real food and some rest. I went down to the cafeteria and ate a turkey sandwich I didn't taste and called Melody to give her the update. Kyle answered her phone. "She's in a meeting," he said. "I'll let her know." "Good news." "That's great." He sounded warm and relieved. He always sounded exactly like what the situation called for. Before Norma was discharged, Agatha called me over one last time. She was being moved to a rehabilitation facility the following morning. She seemed smaller than she had a few days ago, or maybe I was just seeing her more clearly now. She handed me a small piece of paper, a phone number. She said it was her attorney's contact. She said, "If I'm right about what I think I saw, you're going to need someone who specializes in financial elder law." And she said it so matter-of-factly, like she was handing me a weather report. I told her I hoped she was wrong. She said, "So do I, but you remind me of myself the year before I stopped checking." I took the paper, folded it, put it in my shirt pocket. I took Norma home 5 days after she arrived. She was slow on her feet, careful, a little pale, but her eyes were sharp and she made a joke about the hospital food that made me laugh for the first time in a week. I helped her to the couch, got her settled with a blanket and her crossword book, and told her I'd make dinner. That night, after she was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop. I pulled up the portal Kyle had set up. Everything looked normal. Balances, account summaries, recent activity. I'd looked at the screen a dozen times since Kyle had configured it, but this time I looked at it differently. I looked at it the way I used to look at claims files at work. Not for the story on the surface, but for the thing the story was trying not to tell me. I noticed the routing details on one of the linked accounts were different from what I remembered. I didn't know my routing number by heart, but I knew the first few digits of my bank. These were different. I picked up the phone and called Harrington Federal, where Norma and I had banked for 23 years. The woman on the nightline was patient with me. She walked me through what she could see. She asked me to confirm some security questions, and then she told me, very gently, that the account I was looking at in the portal was not my primary account at Harrington Federal. Someone had created a mirror account, same name, similar numbers, different institution, linked to the portal so it looked like my account but directed activity somewhere else. I sat at that table for a long time after I hung up. 2 weeks. That's how long it took, working with a forensic accountant recommended by Agatha's attorney and a detective from the Buncombe County Financial Crimes Unit to get a full picture. Kyle had been at it for 14 months. It hadn't been blunt or obvious. He'd moved money in increments, small transfers here, account adjustments there. A recurring draw on a home equity line he'd quietly opened in both our names using documents I'd signed at a dinner table without reading closely enough. He'd been building access slowly, the way you build anything that's meant to last. The total was $83,000. Not everything, not close to everything. Not close to everything. But enough to hurt, enough to change things, enough to make the next 10 years look different than the ones we'd planned. I need to say something about that number before I go on. People hear a number like that and they calculate it against what they think they know about a family's finances, and they make judgments. What I want you to understand is that $83,000 isn't just a number. It's Norma's medical costs if something goes wrong again. It's the house repairs we've been putting aside for. It's the 10 years of carefully not spending so that we could stop worrying. Kyle didn't just take money. He took the margin. He took the cushion that 68-year-old people need when the world doesn't go the way they plan. The detective's name was Burgess. Quiet man, mid-40s, the kind who wrote everything down with a pen. He sat across from me at my kitchen table and laid out what he had, and he didn't soften it. "Your son-in-law is aware of his exposure," he said. "He's likely already preparing a story. We need to move carefully." I asked about Melody. He paused. "We don't have evidence she participated," he said. "That doesn't mean she wasn't aware. Those are two different things. I'm sorry." I called my older daughter, Rosalind, that evening. She lives in Knoxville with her husband and 2 boys. Rosalind is the quiet one, the steady one. She'd never trusted Kyle, but had never said so to my face. When I finished telling her everything, she was silent for a long time. Then she said, "Dad, I'm getting in the car tonight." I told her she didn't have to. She said, "I know. I'm coming anyway." Rosalind arrived just after midnight. She let herself in with her key, put her bag down in the hallway, and came and sat across from me at the kitchen table without taking off her coat. She looked at everything I'd laid out, the printed statements, the forensic summary, the detective's notes, and she went through it all without saying a word. When she finished, she put both hands flat on the table. "We have to tell Mum," she said. "I know." We told Norma the next morning. I'd been dreading it. Norma had always liked Kyle. She'd said once, quietly, that he reminded her of what she thought a son might have been like if we'd had one. Telling her felt like taking something she'd never gotten back. She sat on the couch and listened to everything I said. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Well, I always thought something was off about the way he talked about money." She wasn't angry yet. That came later. First, she was just clear. The confrontation with Melody happened 4 days after Rosalind arrived. Not because we planned it that way. Because Melody called to say she and Kyle were coming for Sunday dinner as usual, and I said yes, come. Rosalind thought I was making a mistake. She stood in the kitchen and looked at me. "What are you doing?" I told her I needed to see their faces. They arrived at 5 o'clock. Kyle came in carrying a bottle of wine, talking about something he'd seen on the way over, traffic or weather. Melody hugged Norma carefully, mindful of her hip. I watched Kyle move through the kitchen the way he always did, comfortable, familiar, like a man in a space that already belonged to him. We sat down for dinner. I'd made a pot roast, the same thing I made every few Sundays in fall. Candles on the table, the good plates. Kyle poured wine. Talked about a property deal he was working on in Henderson County. Asked Norma how physical therapy was going. He was warm and attentive and completely at ease. After dinner, I excused myself and came back with a manila folder and set it on the table. Kyle looked at it, then at me. "I want to talk about the home equity line," I said. The shift in his face was almost nothing. Almost. If I hadn't been watching for it, I'd have missed it. A blink that lasted a half-second too long. "I don't know what you mean," he said. I opened the folder, set the first page in front of him, the account application with both our names. The notarized signature page. "I never signed this," I said. Melody looked at the page, then at Kyle. "I need to know," I said to Melody, "whether you knew about this." Her face went very still. She looked at Kyle. He was already shaking his head, already setting down his wine glass, already moving into the version of events he prepared. "Your father made some transactions he doesn't remember," Kyle said. His voice was steady and reasonable, and made me want to put my hand through the drywall. I've been trying to protect him from having to deal with the paperwork on his own. He looked at Melody. He's getting older. We've talked about this. Rosalind stood up from the table. Kyle looked at her, then back at me. We can work this out privately, he said. As a family. The Detective Burgess had told me what to say in this moment. Not to accuse. Not to argue. Not to give Kyle information about how much we knew. I just said, I've hired an attorney and a forensic accountant. Their report is complete. The detective from Financial Crimes has a copy. If you'd like to respond, you can do it through your own attorney. The room was very quiet. Then Kyle pushed back from the table, picked up his jacket from the chair, and looked at Melody in a way I can only describe as expectant. Like he was waiting for her to follow. She didn't move. Kyle, she said. Sit down. He looked at her again. Something shifted in his calculation. Melody said very quietly, Did you do this? He said, Mel. She said, Just answer me. He didn't answer. He picked up the wine bottle, set it back down, and walked to the front door. I heard it open and close. Melody sat at my kitchen table and put her face in her hands. Rosalind sat back down. She reached across the table and put her hand on her sister's arm and didn't say anything. I looked at Norma, who was sitting very still with her hands in her lap, and for a moment she looks like the woman I'd married at 26. Clear-eyed and resolved. Past the point of pretending. The legal process took 7 months. Carr's attorney tried several approaches. He tried to argue the transactions were authorized through a verbal agreement. That didn't hold. He tried to claim I had shown signs of cognitive decline and the accounts had been managed for my protection. My doctor testified otherwise. He tried to negotiate a settlement that would have let Kyle repay a portion and avoid criminal charges. Detective Burgess and the DA's office declined. I was in the courtroom when the verdict came back. Melody was sitting 3 rows behind me with Rosalind. Kyle sat at the defendant's table in a grey suit and looked at the surface of the table when the foreman read the words, wire fraud. Financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, 2 counts of forgery. 14 years. He looked older than I'd ever seen him when they let him out. I thought about all the Sunday dinners, all the times he'd poured wine and talked about real estate and made my daughter smile. I thought about the ease of him, and how easy is not the same thing as good, and how long it took me to understand that. Melody did not know. That was the finding, and it matched what I believed, and I was grateful for it. Her own attorney had prepared her for the worst, and she'd survived the best, which is its own kind of wound. She sold the house she and Kyle had bought together. She stayed with us for 6 weeks while she found a new apartment near downtown. There were hard evenings during those 6 weeks. There were evenings when nobody said much, but there were also evenings where the 3 of us, Melody, Norma, and I sat at the same kitchen table where I'd confronted Kyle and played cards and ordered pizza and talked about the boys Rosalind had brought home for Thanksgiving and whether the Appalachian Trail section out past Black Mountain was still too muddy to hike. Normal things. The kind of normal things that feel like miracles after a long time of being afraid. I think about Agatha Ruiz sometimes. I looked for her once, about a year after everything was resolved. I found her at the same rehabilitation facility she'd been transferred to from Mission Hospital. She was in a chair by a window and the light was good and she didn't look as fragile as she had in that hospital room. She remembered me right away, told me I looked better. I thanked her for what she'd done. She said she hadn't done much, just asked a few questions. I told her it was more than that. I told her that asking the right questions at the right moment to someone who hasn't thought to ask them themselves, that's not nothing, that's almost everything. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I waited too long with my own situation. By the time I understood what was happening, most of it was already gone. She looked at her hands. I made a decision after that. Every time I have a chance to say something to someone who might still be in time, I say it. I thought about the hospital room, the curtain between our beds, 2 people in separate crises, separated by a few feet of thin fabric, and how she'd reached through it anyway. I asked how her son was doing. She said, he's trying. She said it in the way that means she knows the trying may not be enough, and she's made her peace with it. We sat together for a while after that, not talking much. The afternoon light came through the window and the facility was quiet and there wasn't much to say that hadn't been said. Before I left, she told me one more thing. She said, "You know what I noticed about you in that hospital room? You were angry at the right things. Some people in your situation, they get angry at the person who's warning them, instead of the situation they're being warned about. You got quiet and you thought about it." She looked at me. "That's not as common as it should be." I drove home to Asheville with the radio off and the windows cracked. Fall was coming in again. Same time of year, almost exactly, as when Norma had slipped on those deck steps and everything started. Norma was in the kitchen when I got home. She'd been in physical therapy for weeks and she moved around the house more easily now, though still carefully. She was making soup from scratch, the chicken and white beans she only made in October. And the smell hit me when I opened the back door and I stood there for a moment, just breathing it in. She looked up and said, "How was she?" I said, "Good, she's good." Norma nodded and turned back to the stove. I stood in the doorway of my own kitchen on an October evening with my wife making soup and the lights low and warm, and I thought about the moment in that hospital room when I couldn't remember the last time I'd checked my own accounts. I thought about how that moment of honesty, that admission to a stranger I'd never met before, had been the thing that saved us. Not the detective, not the attorney, not the forensic accountant. That one honest answer to a question I hadn't expected. I have told this story at senior centers and at church fellowships and at a financial literacy workshop Rosalind helped me put together at the Knoxville Public Library. I have told it to people who shook their heads and told me it couldn't happen to them. I've told it to people who went very quiet and pulled out their phones and called their banks from the parking lot before they got home. I tell it because Agatha Ruiz decided to say something when she could have stayed quiet. I tell it because the woman in the hospital bed next to my wife saw something and didn't look away. I tell it because every person sitting in the room right now with their finances partly managed by someone who says they're just trying to help deserves the same thing Agatha gave me, the moment of question before it's too late. I'm 66 years old. Norma is 69. Our house is still ours. Our savings are reduced but protected and growing again. Melody is building a new life in a new apartment, and she called last Tuesday just to tell me she made the chicken and white bean soup for the first time, and it had turned out right. That was a good Tuesday. If you're listening to this and something in it sounds familiar, the helpfulness that feels a little too managed, the accounts you haven't checked yourself in a while, the signature you put on something without reading it fully, don't wait for the third warning. I almost didn't survive mine. Trust what you already know. I keep coming back to the moment Agatha asked me when I'd last checked my own accounts. Not when someone had shown me a summary. When I had checked myself with my own eyes. And I couldn't answer her. That gap between believing you're paying attention and actually paying attention, that's where Kyle lived for 14 months. What I understand now is that the people who take advantage of the people they're supposed to love aren't usually strangers. They're familiar. They're comfortable. They pour the wine and ask the right questions and make themselves useful in ways that slowly, quietly, move the door a little more open every time. Kyle didn't steal from me all at once. He built access over years, piece by piece, because he understood that I trusted him, and he understood that trust, when it goes unchecked, becomes a kind of blindness. I'm not angry at myself for trusting him. I was doing what you're supposed to do when someone becomes family. But I think about the version of me that never met Agatha Ruiz, never heard that question, never sat at that kitchen table at midnight and looked at my own accounts the way I used to look at claims files at work, with honest eyes instead of hopeful ones. That version of me loses the house. That version of me loses the margin. And that version of me probably never quite understands why. There's something Agatha said that I've thought about almost every day since. She said she made a decision after what happened to her, to speak up whenever she had the chance. Not out of bitterness, out of clarity. She had paid a steep price to understand something true, and she wasn't going to let that understanding go to waste sitting in a chair by a window. That kind of choice, to turn what hurt you into something useful, that's the hardest kind of integrity I know. It requires that you look at the worst thing that happened to you and decide it means something beyond the damage it caused. Melody is rebuilding. That takes a different kind of strength than what I went through, because she didn't just lose money or security. She lost the person she'd built a life around. Watching her sit at my kitchen table after Kyle walked out, watching her not follow him. That was one of the bravest things I've ever seen, and I've been watching her whole life. She didn't collapse into the easier story. She stayed and asked a hard question and took the answer, even when it was the one she'd been afraid of. I'm 66 years old, and I've learned that being wise isn't about knowing more than everyone else. It's about staying curious about your own blind spots. It's about asking, even when the answer might be uncomfortable, whether what you're seeing is actually what's there. I missed the signs with Kyle for years because I was looking at who I hoped he was, instead of who he was showing me he was. That's not stupidity. That's love without enough scrutiny. And the difference between those two things can cost you everything. What saved me was a woman who had nothing left to lose by telling the truth. And the fact that, when she asked me a direct question, I gave her a direct answer, instead of a comfortable one. That moment of honesty, just that one small honest answer in a hospital room at 9 o'clock at night, is the reason Norma and I still have our home. Check your accounts, not because you distrust the people around you, because you owe yourself that much.